Good morning. Good to be back here with you this morning. This morning we have a pretty basic, pretty fundamental topic to discuss. The topic is patience. And it is so basic that it may be a question of whether or not we should even have a lesson on it. But so long as none of us have fully mastered such a basic topic, then we'll continue to have lessons on it. And so unless we can be honest and ask ourselves if we are patient and answer completely affirmatively yes, we might just need a reminder on this topic. But what we're going to do is take a look at a passage in the book of James. In James chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 7, go down through about 12 or 13. And in this text, James is going to discuss the topic of patience. And so what we're going to do first is give a little bit of context to the book of James and to this passage that we're going to look at. And so, to start with, obviously if we're talking about James, we are in the New Testament, and we are after the time of Christ, after the events of his life. And James is going to be writing a letter. He writes a letter to a group of Christians, certainly, but specifically they appear to be Jewish Christians, as in they are ethnically Jews who converted to Christianity. And so that has a little bit of a different background than, say, Christians that were from Greece or from Rome in the same time period. And so he's going to teach them how to act, how to live in faith, but maybe more particularly, he's going to teach them how to respond to the evils that are going on in the world around them. And that by itself is a worthwhile lesson or subject for us to spend time on. The other thing that we might say about James is that sometimes his letter is referred to as the Proverbs of the New Testament in reference to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. The reason that's said is primarily because James gives a lot of the same kind of real-world examples that we see in the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, but I would suggest that it's equally as accurate of a title because James, like Proverbs, a lot of times switches from one verse to the next, the entire subject that's being discussed, to the point that you have no idea what he's going to say next. And that is somewhat reminiscent of Proverbs in the Old Testament. And we'll see that a little bit even in this text, and we'll try to make sense of, well, why are certain verses paired with this subject of patience? The other thing that we might want to do before getting into this text is define a little bit of what we mean by patience. And it seems that there's really two ways primarily that we talk about patience. Number one, patience can be delaying gratification. So you want something, but you can't have it right now. And so you have to be patient while you wait for what you want. Okay, simple enough. The other way in which patience is meant is to suffer through something that's going on in the present that you hope will cease sometime in the future. And so it can be not that you're waiting for something that you want, but that you're waiting for something that you don't particularly like to be over. And so patience can mean either of those things, and both of those will be meant in the text as we look at it. But one last thing we'll say before we get into the text fully is from verse 7, because verse 7 starts by saying, therefore. And so it is tied to whatever has just happened right before that. In this case, James chapter 5, from the beginning of the chapter, has been talking about those who are rich, but more specifically, those who use their position of wealth to manipulate others, to oppress others, to do evil to others. And essentially what James has said in the first few verses here is those rich people, they'll have to answer to God. And the day of judgment will come for them. And so when we get to verse 7, he says, be patient. Part of what he means, a large part of what he means is be patient because the day of the Lord will come. And that means that the good thing that you've been waiting for will be here, that the Lord will return, and that the evil that you've been suffering, that will be over too. And so the patience that you're having now is waiting for the good and waiting through the evil. So in verse 7, let's start into this text and start again with verse 7, therefore be patient. All right, simple enough. So that's the lesson for today, and we'll just end it there. Therefore be patient. Wouldn't that be great? And if we could just listen to that, if we could hear those words and do just that, we'd do pretty well. but we cannot. Therefore, be patient. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look here. First off, the word patient. Some translations have it as long-suffering. Let me suggest that is the more literally accurate way of translating this word from the original language. It means long-suffering. It's a compound word. We translate it as patient because that's how we would understand that today. But it certainly does mean to suffer long. And so it means to endure something, for a long period of time, to go through something. The original word for the suffering part really means more of wrath or even anger, but we get the idea, hopefully, of what's being meant here. We suffer through some kind of evil in particular, and we get through to the other side of it. It's the same word that's used in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 29 in the parable of the unforgiving servant. You'll recall the servant has been asked to pay his debts, and he says, if you'll just be patient with me, if you'll just suffer me a little bit longer, then I'll be able to repay you all the things that I owe you. And that's the idea of patience that we have here, of long suffering. But again, in the context of James chapter 5, what is James really saying? He's saying, therefore be patient, especially, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Why? Well, because when the Lord comes, you'll receive the good things that are due you, and those who have done evil will receive the evil things that are due to them. So be patient until that happens. Now, James is going to give us an illustration to go alongside this. And he's going to give the illustration, verse 7 here, of the farmer. Now, most of us in this room are not farmers. A few of us are farmers. But for those who are, actually it doesn't matter too much whether you are or not, you can understand the illustration that's being used. And so a farmer, particularly, in this case, it says the precious fruit of the earth, but you could apply this equally to cattle farming also. You have to wait either for the crops to grow, or you have to wait for the animal to put on weight, or to calve, or to whatever it is that you're trying to do to produce money, either with the land or with the cattle that you have. Okay, so that's what the farmer does. Now, why does he use this illustration? It is a pretty simple illustration, but let's take two things from it. Number one, he says, be patient like the farmer. How much choice does the farmer have to wait on their crop? Can the farmer make the crop instantly ready for harvest? Is that within his power to do? Obviously not. And so one thing that James may be trying to tell us is sometimes when you're being patient, you can't really do anything to help the process. Now, sometimes you can, but in reality, you are not in control of the speed at which these things take place. And so we are like the farmer in that we cannot make this happen right now. We can't speed it up even if we wanted to. Now, the other side of this, though, is that even if that's true, what else is true of the farmer? Does the farmer plant something and then do nothing for the next 3 or 4 months? Is that how farming works? Not really. And so you don't have the option, just like the farmer does not have the option to sit idly and to do nothing. And so instead, there are things that have to be done. Again, it depends on what kind of farming you are doing, but it may be that you're fertilizing, or it may be that you did that before planting the crops. It may be that you're getting rid of weeds. It may be that you're feeding. It may be that you're doing any number of medical things that are necessary for your livestock. But you have to be working as the process happens. And so, like the farmer, we can't sit idly by, but we also don't have a choice in sitting for a little while. So if we take this back again to what James is trying to tell us in the context, though, isn't this same principle, aren't these same principles true in the return of Christ? Can we affect the speed at which Christ returns to this earth? I don't think so. As far as I can tell, the only person that even knows when that will happen is God the Father. And so I can't do anything to change that, but at the same time, do I get to sit by and do nothing until that happens? No. And so we are patient, but we do some things while we wait. In verse 9 of James chapter 5, it says, do not grumble against one another, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So James brings up a somewhat separate topic here. So we were just talking about being patient, and now he says, grudge not or do not grumble. Well, why the change? And the answer, I think, is straightforward enough, and so we won't try to avoid the point any longer, but to say that oftentimes when we are being impatient, this is what results. The results of impatience, pretty often, are shortness toward others, unkindness in general, maybe even lashing out fully at others. When things are not going the way that we want, when we are suffering, especially for a long time, the result is going to be some of these things. And what James then says is, you should not do this. Why not? Well, because the judge is coming. So the reminder is twofold here. Yes, Christ is going to return, and that's a positive thing for Christians, but at the same time, he will come back, even judging those who have grumbled against one another in the meantime. And so there's a reason for this. Now, all of this is still just at the point of saying, don't be impatient or be patient, but he's not telling us how to do that. Aside from the first example, look to the farmer. Maybe that'll help. But he's going to give us a couple other examples here as well. In verse 10, it says, my brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Okay, so now we have another example to go on. Not just the farming example, but the example of the prophets. Obviously, speaking to a Jewish audience, his readers will be familiar with the idea of the prophets. More specifically, they'll know what happened to the prophets. Now, we do a great job of neglecting the prophets more than any other part of the Bible. That's just how we have tended to operate for a long time. But that's not how it should be, because the prophets are worth learning from. And so take your pick of the prophets. If you're talking about Elijah, or you're talking about Jeremiah, or you're talking about Habakkuk, or you're talking about any number of the prophets, what do they have in common? Number one, that people didn't listen to them as they preached the message of God. Number two, a lot of them died in the attempt of preaching the message of God. Now, I can't imagine any more frustration in terms of patience than trying to preach the message of God to people who actively reject that message constantly and then try to kill you or do succeed in killing you for it. And so James says, do you have it that bad? Or when you look back at the prophets, is that a little bit worse? When you look back to the prophets, didn't they have a hard time being patient? Now, maybe another way that James could mean this is that the prophets preached a message of salvation for Israel, but most of them preached the message of salvation through Jesus Christ, whether or not they recognized that message at the time or not. But they prophesied ahead of time that there would be a Savior to come into the world. The patience that James is talking about may be in reference to that, saying they preached a great message of the good news of Jesus and they didn't even get to experience it themselves. And so some patience would be required for that also. In verse 11, James will give us one more example to look at. Verse 11, indeed we count them blessed who endure. That's probably a reference mostly to the prophets of verse 10. You have heard of the perseverance of Job, and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. The other example that James gives of how to suffer long or how to be patient is that of Job. Now, if we were going to give an example of patience, we might choose Job as well. And hopefully you remember the story of Job. But in Job's case, what James wants to point out about his case is that the intention of God was never for Job to suffer indefinitely. It was not God's plan from the beginning of the book of Job that Job would just be in a miserable existence for the rest of his life. Instead, what James says is that the end intended by the Lord was to show compassion and to show mercy. Now, for Job, in the situation, that's a little bit more challenging to see. For us looking back at Job, we can take these several thousand years that have passed and look to his story and say, yeah, that's true. God intended mercy and compassion. But at the time, could Job see that? And the same thing is true for us. At the time that we're going through the suffering, at the time that we're waiting for something better, can we see the end result? We can't, but God can. And God already had the end intended in mind to show his mercy, to show his compassion. At the end of the book of Job, chapter 42, and in verse 12, Job 42, verse 12, it says, "Now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning." It goes on to talk about how many more animals he had and how many more children he had. And the point is, of course, that Job was more blessed after all of the bad things that happened to him than he was beforehand. God shows his mercy. God shows his compassion toward Job, even if it was hard for Job to see at the time. The last verse that we'll look at in the text here is verse 12, but verse 12 kind of does it again. Same as verse 9, why bring up this topic when you're talking about patience? And this one's maybe a little bit harder to place within the text. We'll go ahead and talk about it. Verse 12. "But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or with any oath, but let your yes be yes, and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment." So another warning is given here. And this time the warning is, don't swear. Now, when we say swear in this case, we're talking about making an oath. This was pretty common among the Jews compared to today. They would swear by anything, usually by God, by the temple, by any number of religious objects, and they would use these in a very casual way to confirm whatever it was they were saying. Now, let me suggest that this does still happen today. You'll hear people say that they swear to fill in the blank that it's just too hot today. Okay? That was worth swearing about, right? That was worth taking an oath just to talk about how high the temperature is today. It doesn't really make sense, and it didn't make sense then either. And James says, don't do that. And really, he's quoting Christ when he says, don't do that. But why bring it up in the context of patience? Well, it's possible that this is being brought up because maybe swearing is more common whenever you are impatient. Now, if you take the modern sense of swearing or cursing, certainly that would be true. But the temptation may be increased if we're talking about any kind of impatience and talking about any kind of swearing. And so it may be that James is saying, and while we're talking about patience, don't do this behavior that you're so used to doing, especially when things are difficult. It could be potentially also that people were swearing in reference to, or taking an oath in reference to, when Christ would return. He says, be patient for the return of the Lord. It may be that what James is talking about is that some of his readers were guilty of saying, well, I know that the Lord will come. In fact, I'm so sure, let me swear by him that it will happen this way. Or it could be that swearing had something to do instead with those who are rich and those who are oppressing this group of people. And so it may be that they're swearing some not great things that they'll do toward those who are in the position over them, this position of wealth that brought up this whole issue of patience to begin with from the beginning of the chapter. But whichever of those it may be, it seems that there is a good reason that he brings it up, one that his original audience probably knew a little bit better than we do today. And so, what do we do when we think about, when we try to be patient? Well, let's start with what we just ended on, and start with this, saying that we shouldn't, or we should try, to not let our impatience become sin. So there is a difference between being impatient and sinning. We won't get into all of that, but that's some of the warning that's given here. The warning is that if you allow it to become a bigger problem, it can present any number of problems. It can end up causing you to swear by certain things that you shouldn't be. It can end up causing you to grumble against or even hold grudges against others. And so certainly those would be pretty big problems by themselves. It can also cause health problems. It can cause sleeplessness. It can cause a lot of time being lost on things that are more important. The more that we are impatient, the more that we're looking into the future to see something that we want that we don't have right now, the more time is lost on that. And so any of that could end up in a position of sin rather than just a position of impatience. But what else can we look at? One other thing we would say is that patience is multi-leveled. Maybe that's the best way to say it, probably not the best word. But patience has different stages to it. And so patience can mean that we're talking about in the moment that something happens. That kind of patience, I think most any of us struggle with. And so we would look to the example of Christ, perhaps. How many of us would be patient in the moment when someone is beating us, when someone is cursing us, when someone spits in our face? How patient could we be? We look to the example of Christ and we say, that's the goal, and then here's where I am. And so, in the moment, there's patience that's required. But also, patience is required to wait for something better. I don't know what you're going through in your life right now. You don't know what I'm going through in my life right now. We can change a little bit of that if we're willing to open up. But the point of patience is to say that it doesn't matter exactly what it is that you're going through. But patience is required to get to somewhere better than you are right now. So you may be in a pretty good place right now, but plenty of people are not. But while you wait for that better situation or while you're going through whatever trial it may be, you wait for something better. The third part of patience is in the long term. And so it may be that patience is required on your part to wait for something that's a lifelong goal, or just to wait on the lifelong goal of being saved in Christ. It takes one's entire life to get to that point, but patience is required even for the longer term. Sometimes we use this phrase about trust. Let me suggest it applies pretty well to patience also. The phrase being that patience is built, not given. Patience is built, not given. What's that mean? It means no one is patient. How patient is a young child? Not so patient. Not most of the time. I'll say for my own part, I thought of myself as being pretty patient. As a general rule, I think most of what I meant in kind of the medium term or long term. But patience is different when you have a toddler, right? If you've had a toddler, you know that that's true. And there's a relearning of patience that happens. It's a whole new kind of patience that you didn't have to have before. But patience is built. Like any other skill, like any other virtue, it takes time for us to get from point A to point B. To go from unable to respond appropriately to being able to wait just a little bit longer. One other thing we'll say is, or ask, is what do we do then with patience as a whole? Because all we've said so far really is that it's hard to be patient. And all James has said is, you should really look to a few of these examples and see if that will help. Okay, let's be a bit more specific. And we'll go from the text here and we'll say, well, what can we do whenever we find ourselves in a situation that we need patience? Let's suggest these things. So this may not be the whole answer, but it's a pretty good start from this text. Number one, let go of the things that you cannot control. Well, that's pretty simple. But why do we say it from this text? Well, we already pointed to the example of the farmer that James gives. Is there any chance that the farmer can make something happen more quickly than God will allow it to happen? And is there any chance that we can do that in our own life? Not so much. And so we wait for the things that we cannot control. The second thing we can do is to use the examples that we've been given. It's not that we have to learn everything on our own, but instead we look to Scripture and we say, okay, I can compare myself to what the prophets endured in the Old Testament. Or I can look to the New Testament example of Christ himself and say, okay, maybe I can learn to be a bit more like that and a lot less like how I am now. The third thing is that we at least try to remember what it is that we are waiting for. Again, this section starts out, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Okay? Well, when the coming of the Lord happens, how much will the situation that I'm in right now, the things that cause me stress right now, the things that I'm having to suffer through, the things that I'm being patient about, how much will they matter when Christ has returned? Sometimes I'll ask the question, and so I'll ask it again here, just to give a bit of perspective. How much will whatever it is that I'm going through right now matter 10,000 years from today? And the answer should be pretty obvious. It will not matter in the slightest. And so patience is certainly required, but perspective alongside it is also necessary. The other thing that James mentions that we didn't read starts in verse 13. It says, "Is anyone among you suffering?" Now remember, the word that's being used in verse 7 and verse 8, that word is long suffering. It should be translated that way, can be translated that way. And so James will ask within the same chapter, what should you do if you are suffering? If you're going through this period of long suffering, and he says, let him pray. Now again, we talk about prayer a lot. Often we discount it as, okay, well, all you can do is pray about it. Yes, but all you can do is pray about it. All you can do is ask the Almighty Creator of the universe if He can assist you. Does that matter just a little bit? And can that change our perspective whenever we find ourselves a little impatient? And maybe, it's not guaranteed, but maybe if patience is something we're able to obtain in any capacity, then maybe the latter days of our life can be better, or at least we can recognize that things are better than those former days, like in the life of Job. So this morning, if you are suffering, the encouragement of Job, or the encouragement of James, is ironically, if you're suffering, suffer a little bit longer. Be patient a little bit longer, because the day of the Lord will come, because He will return to this earth, and that means that we will have the good that we've waited for. That means that those who have done evil will be rewarded their evil as well. This morning, if there's one thing that it is not worth being patient about, if that's the right way to say it, is about your own condition, your own position in relation to God. This morning, if you're not a child of God, this is your opportunity. This morning, if you've never been obedient to Him, this is the chance to talk to somebody about that, to ask for help for that. This morning, if you have any other need that is pressing, don't be patient in that one area, and get whatever assistance it is that you need. If there's anything that we can do, we ask that you come now as we stand, as we sing.